All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 20, Section 4, Social and Labor Unrest in the 1890s. So in particular, the decade of the 1890s was an especially turbulent decade. A lot going on in the United States, a lot of social unrest taking place. A lot of these are a lot of the issues during the late Gilded Age were as a result of economic downturns. One thing that characterized the Gilded Age was a very up and down economy. Sometimes we call this the boom and bust economy. And practically every 20 years, there was a major economic depression. First, starting from the Panic of 1873, and a little bit later on, the Panic of 1893, or the Depression of 1893, which was caused in part to overinvestment in railroads. Railroads were an incredibly profitable business, but after a while, as companies and investors continued to pour money into railroad companies, eventually those companies just didn't make any profit. That once the country was connected in a certain sense, additional railroads really didn't see an increase. Once the transcontinental railroad was laid down and you had a train that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right, that opened up the entire West economically speaking. But as the decades began to go on, you didn't get the same amount of profit back from new railroad lines, which again, at that time had previously been kind of, undeveloped. But now that it was developed, you just didn't see the same type of, return on it. And so because there was an overinvestment in railroads, lots of railroad companies went under, and this set in the Depression of 1893, which led to, amongst other things, we also talked about in a previous chapter, the Homestead Strike, led to worker or labor unrest, right? An increase in the amount of strikes going on. The Pullman strike, the Homestead strike in particular, both of them took place in the 1890s. Another instance of social unrest, and when we think about social means society. Coxey's army, an army of, or a group, I should say, they weren't really an army, a group of unemployed Ohioans, so they're from Ohio, however you spell Ohioans, marched on D.C., that's the capital of the nation, demanding jobs, right? So whether it's workers going on strike at the Homestead Steel Facility, the Pullman strike, which was the railroad strike, or Coxey's army, this group of unemployed workers marching on the nation's capital demanding jobs, all of these contribute to the social and labor unrest that you experience in the 1890s. Now, at the same time, a very important election was to be had in 1896, which saw social unrest combined with the emerging unrest among farmers, and that, of course, is the Populist Party. And in this election, William McKinley ran for the Republican side. He was more or less pro-business. And for the Democratic side, you had William Jennings Bryan. And what Bryan had done was actually quite brilliant. He had adopted a lot of the populist sentiment and some of the things that he was talking about, like using silver in the monetary system, like the damages that things like tariffs had done to the U.S. economy, the workers and the farmers in particular. He was getting a lot of popularity, not just amongst the farmers, but also amongst a wide range of Americans who wanted to challenge business interests. During this election, William McKinley used what was called the front porch campaign. That means he never left his home. Of course, McKinley had the interest of business and banking on his side. Whereas we might say that for William Jennings Bryan, he was more a candidate of the people. He was the populist candidate. And, Bryan, one of the things that he did in the Democratic Party is that by endorsing the populists, by taking up some of the things that were on the Populist Party platform, the Populist Party had a difficult choice to make. And that was, do you support the Democrats or do you support your own separate political party? And one way that William Jennings Bryan won over the populace was through his Cross of Gold speech, which he famously said, business will not crucify man on a cross of gold. This, of course, was getting to the major issue of the day of gold versus silver. And of course, those interests, including business and banking, wanted a monetary system that is the dollar, right, what money is based off of, wanted that based only off gold. Whereas, farmers especially wanted a monetary system that was much more open, much more currency to be available, wanted a gold and silver monetary system, and saying, essentially this Cross of Gold speech saying that businesses and banks will not crucify mankind on a cross of gold meant that, that William Jennings Bryan was kind of a champion for the people. Bryan, rather than, in comparison to McKinley's front porch campaign, Bryan gave, thousands of speeches. He traveled through the entire nation and usually in the back of a train car, got massive amount of crowds. But when all the votes were counted, William McKinley won this very decisive and important election. And that election for McKinley meant the death of the Populist Party. Essentially, the Populists had thrown all of their weight behind Bryan, that even though they were a separate political party, that William Jennings Bryan was a candidate who endorsed populist ideas. And they threw their whole organization behind Bryan. And once Bryan lost that election, the Populist Party really ceased to exist. Voter turnout in this election was at an all-time high. This was the case pretty much throughout the Gilded Age. Voter participation was very, very high. And you can see from this map here where Bryan won and where McKinley won, that McKinley was much more popular in the north, right? In these areas right, in these areas right here. Maybe there's some residual effect from the Civil War going on, but McKinley was incredibly popular in the South, Bryan was more popular in the South and more popular in the West, where you may have more farms, for example. You have less of a interest of business, right? Business and industry were mostly located in the north here. Banks were located here in places like New York. And so really what that led to was the decline of the Populist Party. So very rarely in American history do you actually have a third party come to the forefront of national politics and challenge the two prevalent parties. And the best thing that really third parties can hope for is that one of the two major political parties will take up your message. And that's essentially what Bryan did. You can see here, William Jennings Bryan, the populist, is swallowing up the Democratic Party, meaning that the Populist Party is now kind of taken over that political party with its message. But after the election of 1896, with McKinley's victory, that movement, that populist movement, more or less dies out.